for more cuts in domestic spending, another increase in military spending, and one of the largest deficits in our history, $91.5 billion. Early this morning, Steve Bell and I spoke with the Secretary of the Treasury, Donald Regan, about the budget proposals. Mr. Secretary, good morning.
Morning, David.
Apparently even some of the president's biggest supporters are concerned about the proposed budget. Senator Stevens said he's in a state of shock. Senator Dole said he's frightened. What's your response to those presidential supporters this morning?
Well, those deficits are larger than any that we've had in bygone history, but I think that everything is relative, David. What you have to remember is these deficits are no larger relative to our gross national product in 1982 and 1983 than the deficits were in 74, 75, or even some other years.
What about the people who say, though, that these deficits will drive up interest rates and stall the growth of the economy, which is the basis for the whole strength of the economy you're looking for?
That doesn't have to happen and probably won't, because I think the rate of savings will increase. That was the whole premise for the tax cuts last year. Tax cuts to business, tax cuts to individuals, to get more savings in this country. And if there's a larger pool of savings, we needn't crowd each other out.
Now, you've come in, Mr. Secretary, under $100 billion with your own projection. But Jim Jones, who's chairman of the House Budget Committee, says, number one, you're using unreal optimistic projections, and number two, that you have completely underestimated the deficit that your own budget proposals will produce. Can you guarantee the American people this morning that if the Reagan budget's approved, it'll stay under $100 billion?
Well, obviously, there can't be any guarantees because one never knows what the state of the economy will do. There could be any number of untoward outside happenings that would throw things out. But if we stick to the cuts that we have, our assumptions are, the economic assumptions are not that great. As a matter of fact, some of us think they were too modest compared to what happened coming out of previous recessions.
Do you think, though, that you have just these reactions that David mentioned? I mean, it's almost across the board on the Hill, an extremely negative reaction, and particularly toward the budget projection deficit. Do you think you're going to be able to get this program through?
Well, we're certainly going to try. Recall that a year ago, sitting in this same chair, you were saying, do you think you'll ever get those tax cuts through or ever get those budget cuts through? Well, we did. We did rather well. You've got to remember something. This is an election year. And as far as Democrats are concerned, literally, what are they saying? If I read what they're saying correctly, what they're actually saying is we want bigger government and we want more taxes.
What they're really saying is that they're going to try to help you bring the budget deficit down lower than you've projected. Will you fight that?
Well, how? How are they going to do it? We won't fight more spending cuts if done in the proper areas, but we certainly will fight any tax increases, such as doing away with the third-year tax cut, the 10% in 1983.
Mr. Secretary, how committed is the president to the proposed increases in the defense budget? Because, again, across the board, people in Congress are saying that they think that's an area where there's going to have to be some cuts.
The president's very committed to this, David. You see, he's working there in the international arena where we're up against a very tough opponent in the Soviet Union, who over the last 10 years have been increasing their military buildup year after year after year. And in point of fact, we've been letting ours run down. Now, what's going to happen? We're going to have to play catch-up, and that's exactly what we're doing. The president feels that we have to be strong in defense.
People in the locality, across the cities, states, counties, Mr. Secretary, are saying that they cannot pick up the slack because of the massive cuts in social programs at the local levels. Mayor Koch of New York said yesterday this is a war in the cities. What's the message to the people across the country this morning?
Well, the message is that under the federalism proposal that the president unveiled a couple of weeks ago, we are going to send programs back to the states and to the cities, yes, but we're going to send $1 for $1 program.
But that's down the road, Mr. Secretary, a year, 2, 3 years from now. That's not what happens in the meantime.
Well, in the meantime, what we're literally doing on most of the entitlement programs is just slowing the rate of increase. We are not cutting back. In actual terms, the rate of increase is slowing down.
Mr. Secretary, the poll that came out just this past week in Newsweek magazine said that 80% of the American people now perceive that Reagan economic proposals are designed primarily to help the rich and big business. Are you concerned that that perception can undermine the whole program?
it possibly could if the belief were held by too many people. But I think that most people, upon analysis, while they realize that, sure, business did get a tremendous break, what we're trying to do, we're trying to modernize our plant and our equipment. We're trying to get greater productivity. We're trying to produce more jobs for people. You can't do that if you continually tax business at a high level.
Mr. Secretary, finally, you know as well as anybody in Washington what's going on in the business community because of your business background. We're hearing that business is not going to invest, make the capital investments and so forth until they see lower interest rates and some strength in the economy. What's your message to big business in Wall Street today?
Well, look, what they're literally saying is get interest rates down, and then we'll do it. With the current high rates of interest, there's no way that building new plant, new commercial buildings and the like can be made profitable. What business wants are lower rates of interest, and that's what we're determined to give them.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. 18 minutes after 7, that was Secretary of the Treasury Donald Reagan. Representative James Jones is chairman of the House Budget Committee. He's in Washington right now with Steve Bell to talk about the budget. Good morning, Mr. Jones. Welcome back.
Good morning, David. How are you?
Fine, sir. Thank you. What's your biggest concern about the budget and why?
I'd say I have a couple of concerns. First of all, the budget deficits are much too large, and as long as they're this large for this long a period of time into the future, interest rates are going to stay high. Without interest rates coming down, there will be no economic recovery.
All right, excuse me, but the Secretary of Treasury just told us that didn't necessarily have to happen, that savings will go up as well and maybe offset your concern.
I'd make two observations. First of all, they said the same thing last year when we argued that you've got to get those deficits down and you have to have a credible path to balancing the budget or getting the deficits to a manageable size. What we were concerned about last year came true. Interest rates stayed high. They're going back up again. And so I think we should have learned something from that lesson last year. So, and secondly, as far as personal savings are concerned, even the administration's own projections on personal savings is not is not a record level of savings. It's about average for any period of time, around 6-7%. And so unless you get an unexpectedly large increase in personal savings, these large deficits will continue to keep interest rates very high and thwart business recovery.
How will you try to get the deficits down?
Pardon?
How will you try to get the deficits down?
I think you have to be honest with the American people and determine, after you've cut the spending and determine what the essential elements of government are, you have to pay for it. And that means taxes. That means raising revenues. Either the next generation and our grandchildren are going to pay the debts we accumulate now, or we ought to be brave enough to pay them ourselves.
Is this Congress going to force the president into some tax increases that he's not asking for?
Well, I see a lot of similarities of 1982 to the spring of 1980. At that particular time, and with a Democratic president and a budget that was submitted, the financial markets reacted negatively to that budget. At a point in the spring of 1980, Democrats and Republicans in Congress got together with the administration and said, we've got to do something to straighten this mess out. We did it. I hope we can do that again in 1982.
But he rolled over you last year. Is this going to be a different Congress? Are enough Democrats and Republicans going to get together to force him into changes?
Well, I think every year is different, and you have to react to the circumstances. The economic mess is much deeper this year than it was last year. The problems are more difficult, and to solve them is going to take some bipartisan approaches. And so I think this year is different than last year.
Let's take a specific here, defense spending. A lot of Republicans now saying we can't leave defense spending away from the budget acts. Is there going to be a consensus that will not give Ronald Reagan what he's asking for in defense spending?
I think very clearly there is a consensus among Democrats and Republicans alike in Congress that we're building up the Pentagon spending much too rapidly, and it cannot be efficiently spent. At a time when our allies are increasing their defense expenditures 3% or less, we're going to be increasing our military expenditures over 13%. I think many in Congress, a consensus believes that we're taking on too great a share of the burden. And yes, I do think there'll be a consensus to reduce that growth.
What will you do regarding the president's proposals on more cuts in the social spending area?
That is another problem with the president's budget, in that it extends the unfairness in the distribution of sacrifice that existed in last year's budget, again to this year's budget. For example, in the entitlement cuts, over 60% of those cuts fall on those who are needs tested, the truly low-income, needy people. And I think Congress will try to redistribute that sacrifice and to make it more fair than now exists.
Very few seconds. Ed Meese says, don't underestimate the president's ability to get the people behind him.
I don't underestimate the president's ability to do that, but I also don't